You think you know how empires are built. You think it's about flags and armies and great men making speeches in gilded halls. You've been sold a story of industrial might, of naval supremacy, of a civilizing mission that spread across the globe. The British Empire. The very words conjure images of stability, of law, of the pound sterling as the bedrock of global finance. That is a carefully packaged illusion. The darkest truths are always the ones hidden in plain sight, buried in the accounting ledgers and shipping manifests that nobody ever bothers to read. The truth is, the engine of the largest empire the world has ever known wasn't powered by coal or steam. It was powered by addiction. It wasn't built on the export of British values, but on the trafficking of a drug. And it wasn't funded by ingenuity alone, but by a cycle of debt and violence so ruthless, so efficient, that its echoes still dictate the boom and bust of the markets you depend on today. The story of the British Empire is the story of the world's first and most successful state-sponsored narco-cartel. It's a story about how to create a customer base out of thin air by getting them hooked, and then using their addiction to drain their wealth, seize their assets, and rewrite the rules of global trade with the barrel of a gun. This isn't just history, it's a playbook. And if you don't understand the plays, you are, and always will be, on the losing side of the game. So the question is, how did they do it? And more importantly, how are they still doing it to you? To understand this heist, you have to start with a problem. A very simple, very expensive problem. By the late 18th century, Britain had a China problem, or more accurately, a tea problem. The British public was absolutely, ravenously obsessed with Chinese tea. It was the oil, the coffee, the must-have consumer good of its day. They were also desperate for Chinese silk and porcelain. The growing British middle class couldn't get enough of it. But here was the catch. Britain produced almost nothing that China wanted. They'd offer woolens, and the Chinese, living in a subtropical climate, would politely laugh. They'd offer complex machinery, and the Qing dynasty, content in its self-sufficient agrarian economy, would shrug. The Chinese had a massive trade surplus, and they demanded payment in the one thing every empire understood: silver. For Britain, this was a national security crisis disguised as a trade deficit. Every ship that sailed to Canton loaded with tea was a ship that sailed from London hemorrhaging silver. The nation's treasury was a melting ice cube. Wealth, real hard money, was draining out of the country and pooling in China. From London's perspective, this was unsustainable. An empire cannot project power if its vaults are empty. It was a slow-motion financial collapse. They needed to find a product, any product. They needed to find a way to reverse that flow of silver, or the whole imperial project would come crashing down. Enter the British East India Company. Don't let the quaint name fool you. The EIC was not some folksy trading guild. It was a monster. A private corporation with its own army, its own navy, and its own territory. It ruled most of India as a corporate fiefdom. It was the Blackwater, the Amazon, and the Federal Reserve of its day, all rolled into one shareholder-owned entity. And it was the EIC, facing its own debt and desperate for profits, that landed on the perfect product: opium. In its conquered Indian territory of Bengal, the conditions were perfect for growing the opium poppy. The EIC established a total monopoly. They forced Indian farmers to cultivate it, bought the raw product for a fixed low price, processed it into pure, addictive cakes, and then prepared it for market. But here's the quiet genius of the plan. The EIC didn't sell the opium to China directly. Oh no, that would be uncivilized. That would violate the Chinese emperor's ban on the drug. Instead, they held auctions in Calcutta. They sold the opium chests to private traders, the so-called country traders, a network of British, American, and Parsi merchants who were willing to do the dirty work. These traders would then sail their fast clipper ships to the Chinese coast, anchor offshore, and sell the opium to Chinese smugglers in exchange for, you guessed it, silver. The silver would then be used by those same traders to buy tea in Canton, which they sold back to the East India Company. Do you see the perfection of this triangle? It was a closed loop of financial engineering that was both brilliant and diabolical. The EIC never officially touched the illegal drug trade. It maintained plausible deniability. Yet, its profits soared. the silver drain was plugged and then dramatically reversed. Silver began pouring out of China and into the coffers of the EIC and, by extension, the British Treasury. The national accounts were balanced. The empire was saved. The city of London flourished, all on the back of a flower grown by subjugated farmers and sold to create addicts. And here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because a product like opium doesn't just generate revenue, it destroys the customer. The trickle of opium into China became a flood. By the 1830s, there were millions of addicts. It wasn't just poor laborers, it was merchants, scholars, government bureaucrats, and even soldiers. The addiction hollowed out Chinese society from the inside. Productivity plummeted. The fabric of communities frayed and then tore apart. The Chinese government was not blind. They saw a demographic and economic catastrophe unfolding. The Daoguang emperor saw his people being turned into ghosts and his empire's silver reserves, which had taken centuries to accumulate, vanishing in a few short decades. This wasn't trade, it was chemical warfare waged on an economic battlefield. So, in 1839, the emperor sent an official, Lin Zexu, to Canton to end the trade for good. Lin was incorruptible. He was a man on a mission. He blockaded the foreign traders in their factories, demanding they hand over their entire stock of opium. After a 6-week standoff, they complied. Lin Zexu destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium, nearly 3 million pounds of the drug, by mixing it with lime and salt and flushing it into the sea. From a moral standpoint, it was a righteous act. From a financial standpoint, he had just set fire to the entire business model of the British Empire. And this is the moment the mask comes off. This is the moment the illusion of commerce gives way to the reality of power. The British traders in Canton, these drug traffickers, didn't just absorb the loss. They went crying to the British Crown, demanding compensation. They framed Lin's actions not as a desperate attempt to save his country, but as an attack on British property and an insult to British dignity. And the British government, whose own finances were now inextricably linked to the profits of this poison, listened. The debate in Parliament was a masterclass in cynical rebranding. They weren't fighting for the right to sell drugs, of course not. They were fighting for free trade. They were fighting for the principle of international law. They were defending the honor of the flag against a barbaric and insolent regime. It was a lie, a beautiful, patriotic, and profoundly effective lie. And so the gunboats were sent. The First Opium War had begun. What followed was not a war, it was a massacre. Industrialized Britain's steam-powered warships and modern artillery met China's traditional war junks and outdated cannons. The result was a foregone conclusion. The British didn't just win, they brutalized the Chinese coast, seizing city after city. The irony was brutal. A nation that claimed to be the pinnacle of Christian civilization was waging war to force another nation to buy a product that was illegal in its own country. It was a war fought for the profits of drug dealers under the banner of free trade. The playbook never changes. The war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. And if you ever want to see how finance is used as a weapon, you need to read this treaty. China was forced to pay millions in silver dollars to Britain, not just for the cost of the war, but to compensate the British drug dealers for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. Let that sink in. They were forced to pay the drug cartel for its confiscated product. They were also forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, giving them a permanent, strategic deep-water port right on China's doorstep. A perfect, secure base for future trading and smuggling operations. And finally, they were forced to open up 5 treaty ports to foreign traders, where British law, not Chinese law, would apply. The sovereignty of China was shattered. A century of humiliation had begun. And for Britain, the profits were astronomical. The opium trade exploded. The flow of silver from China became a torrent. This wealth didn't just sit in a vault. It funded the Royal Navy. It financed the railways in India. It fueled the Industrial Revolution back home. The grand architecture of Victorian London, the museums, the universities, much of it was built on the profits of narcotized Chinese labor. The illusion of a noble empire was financed by the reality of a brutal protection racket. So what does this mean for you today? Why is a 180-year-old drug war relevant to your finances, your job, your future? Because the patterns established then are the same patterns running the world now. The language has changed, the technology has evolved, but the underlying mechanics of power and money are identical. First, the creation of artificial demand. The British needed to sell a product to balance their books. When China didn't want their legitimate goods, they didn't innovate better products, they pushed an addictive one. They created a need that didn't exist and then profited from servicing it. Does that sound familiar? Look at the modern financial world. The constant invention of ever more complex derivatives, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations. These aren't products that the real economy was asking for. They are products created by the financial industry for the financial industry, pushed onto the market, creating a systemic addiction to leverage and complexity that benefits the sellers far more than the buyers. You are constantly being sold financial products you don't need: credit cards with crippling interest, investment vehicles with hidden fees, mortgages designed to extract maximum value. The goal is the same: create a dependency, then drain the wealth. Second, the myth of free markets. The British used the noble-sounding phrase free trade to justify a war that forced a sovereign nation to accept poison. The market was only free when it served their interests. The moment China exercised its sovereign right to say no, the free market was backed up by gunboats. We see this today, but with different weapons. When banks take insane risks and win, it's called capitalism, and the profits are privatized. When they take those same risks and lose, threatening the whole system, it's called a systemic crisis, and the losses are socialized. You, the taxpayer, bail them out. The market is free on the way up, but it's a state-guaranteed monopoly on the way down. The playbook is identical: privatize the gains, socialize the losses, freedom for them, austerity for you. And the most important echo of all, the narcotic of cheap money. Opium was the drug that kept the British imperial financial system afloat. It papered over the cracks of a massive trade deficit and created a phantom prosperity. Today, our narcotic is debt. For decades, the global economy has been addicted to cheap money, to near zero interest rates, to quantitative easing. It's a financial opioid. It dulls the pain of a hollowed-out manufacturing base, stagnant wages, and declining productivity. It creates asset bubbles in stocks and real estate that feel like real wealth, just as an opium high feels like real happiness. But it's an illusion. It hollows out the real economy from the inside, leaving it fragile and dependent on the next fix from the central bank. And everyone in power is terrified of the withdrawal because they know how painful it will be. So they just keep pushing the dose higher. History doesn't just rhyme, it's a repeating fractal of human greed and power dynamics. The British East India Company created a system where they controlled the supply of a drug that created its own demand, and they used that system to extract the real wealth, silver, from an entire nation. Today, central banks and financial institutions control the supply of the modern drug credit, which creates its own artificial demand for assets, and they use that system to extract real wealth from the wages and savings of the working and middle classes. So here is the core lesson, the uncomfortable truth that this channel exists to expose. The systems that govern your life are often not designed for your benefit. The story you are told about economic growth or market stability is often a cover for a vast, institutionalized transfer of wealth. An empire built on opium is no different from a financial system built on unsustainable debt. Both are hollow at their core, both require an ever-increasing dose to stave off collapse. And in both cases, when the collapse inevitably comes, it won't be the people at the top who pay the price, it will be you. But recognizing the pattern is the first step toward breaking it in your own life. You can't change the global system, but you can change how you interact with it. You can learn to distinguish between real value and a temporary high. You can avoid becoming a debt serf in a system designed to create them. You can own real assets, not just paper promises. You can understand that when someone is pushing a financial product on you with urgency, you are likely the source of their profit, not the beneficiary. They built an empire on addiction. Today's empires are built on debt. The drug may have changed, but the business model is exactly the same. The first step to not being a customer is to know you're the product.